What if someone was always watching you? What if every move you made, every place you went, every outfit you wore was being noted by someone hiding in the shadows? The phone rings. A voice you almost recognize whispers your name. Some days it speaks with love, other days with rage. You tell your family, your friends, but no one knows who it is, and then one night, you vanish without a trace. Your car is found burning. Your voice is never heard again. This is the real-life nightmare of a 32-year-old mother who was stalked, hunted, and ultimately taken. And the most terrifying part? Her killer may have been closer than anyone realized. Anaheim, California, the early 1980s. Known for its sunny suburbs and the magic of Disneyland, it's a place where families feel safe. In a quiet neighborhood nearby, Dorothy Jane Scott is living a simple, unassuming life. By all accounts, Dorothy is the last person anyone would expect to become the center of a chilling mystery. Dorothy lives in Stanton, a small community on the outskirts of Anaheim, with her aunt. She's a devoted single mother to her 4-year-old son, whom she adores. Friends and family describe Dorothy as kind, responsible, and deeply rooted in her faith. A devout Christian, she doesn't drink, doesn't do drugs, and prefers quiet nights at home over the nightlife of Southern California. In many ways, 32-year-old Dorothy is a homebody, content to spend her evenings reading bedtime stories or watching cartoons with her little boy instead of going out on the town. During the day, Dorothy works as a secretary for 2 small stores in Anaheim that are jointly owned by the same managers. One is a hippie-themed gift shop called Swinger's Psych Shop, selling love beads and lava lamps. The other is a head shop selling incense and psychedelic trinkets. Dorothy's co-workers know her as reliable and sweet, the sort of person who would drop everything to help a friend. In fact, her parents, Jacob and Vera Scott, often babysit their grandson while she works because Dorothy never wants to impose on anyone unnecessarily. Jacob and Vera, Dorothy's parents, live just a few miles away in Anaheim. Every morning, Dorothy drives her son to her parents' house before work, and every evening she picks him up for supper. It's a comfortable routine in a close-knit family. Dorothy's life revolved around her son and her family. There was no steady boyfriend, no dramatic relationships, just the steady rhythm of work, church on Sundays and family time. But beneath the California sunshine that spring, a shadow was creeping into Dorothy's life. It started as a whisper in the background of her day, anonymous phone calls that began in early 1980. At first, Dorothy shrugged them off as perhaps prank calls. But as weeks passed, the calls became a regular, disturbing intrusion. She confided in her mother that the voice on the other end of the line sounded vaguely familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. Sometimes the caller would express undying love, other times venomous hatred, and he always seemed to know where Dorothy was and what she was doing. By now, Dorothy's once carefree routine had been pierced by a sense of fear. What had been an ordinary life was turning into a nightmare of uncertainty. She had no idea who could be doing this or why she had been targeted. All she knew was that an unseen stalker had fixed his attention on her, and he was growing more and more obsessed. Little did Dorothy know, these unsettling events were only the prelude to a far more terrifying ordeal. The stage was being set for a mystery that would haunt her family and confound investigators for decades to come. It always seemed to happen when Dorothy was alone. The phone would ring, cutting through the silence. When Dorothy lifted the receiver to her ear, she would hear him, the mysterious caller. Sometimes he spoke in a low, almost tender murmur. Other times his voice crackled with anger. But every call carried an undercurrent of menace.
Hello, my love. I've been watching you. You're so beautiful. I'd do anything for you.
The first time, he professed love, a strange, obsessive kind of adoration that left Dorothy uneasy. She couldn't help but wonder if it was a joke or a mistake. But the calls kept coming, and the tone quickly changed. Soon, his words turned threatening.
You'll be sorry. I'll see to it. When I get you alone, I will cut you up into bits so no one will ever find you.
These were not idle threats. On another occasion, he chillingly described how he would kidnap Dorothy and kill her. Then, disturbingly, his tone would swing back to sickly sweet, as if he were in love. Dorothy realized she was dealing with someone unhinged, someone who might truly mean her harm. Worse, the caller seemed to know Dorothy's every move. He'd prove it with little details. "That dress you wore to work today, the blue one, you looked beautiful." Or, "I saw you standing by your car at lunch." Dorothy's blood would run cold. He was clearly spying on her somehow. He even described things inside her house. It was as if he had eyes everywhere. Every time the phone rang, Dorothy's heart would pound. At work, at home, it didn't matter. The stalker could reach her anywhere. The calls were frequent and relentless. Dorothy began to fear that any time she was alone, he might be nearby, watching. Her family noticed the change in her. The once carefree young woman grew anxious and hypervigilant. One day, the caller gave Dorothy a very specific instruction that horrified her.
Go outside. I left you a present.
Intrigued and afraid, Dorothy cautiously stepped out into the parking lot, scanning the area. She found no one, but on the hood of her car lay a single object, a single dead red rose, a dead rose, left like a morbid calling card. It was a message without words. "I'm here." Dorothy's blood ran cold. How long had he been lurking nearby to leave this on her car? What twisted mix of love and hate did this symbol represent? She now knew these calls were not a prank. They were a serious threat. The calls were escalating, the stalker growing bolder. He was no longer content to terrorize her over the phone. He wanted her to feel his presence in her daily life. Fearing for her safety, Dorothy decided to take action. She confided in her parents about the ongoing harassment. They urged her to be careful and suggested maybe it was time to involve the police. Dorothy wasn't sure. She had so little to offer the police, just a voice on the phone, a rose, vague threats. The stalker hadn't physically harmed her yet. In 1980, stalking wasn't as well understood by law enforcement. Dorothy worried she might not be taken seriously. Instead, she took personal precautions. She started considering buying a handgun for protection. And about a week before that fateful night, she signed up for karate lessons at the local community center. If this creep ever tried to lay hands on her, she wanted to be ready. By day, Dorothy even began changing small habits, parking closer to the building, never walking alone if she could help it. Friends would later recall how on edge she was. Still, Dorothy didn't let fear paralyze her. She kept working, kept caring for her son, and tried to maintain a normal routine, but she was always looking over her shoulder. Each ring of the telephone was met with dread. Who was he? What did he look like? Was it someone she passed by every day without knowing? These questions gave Dorothy sleepless nights. And then, as May 1980 neared its end, those threatening whispers in the phone turned into an all-too-real nightmare. Dorothy went to work as usual, unaware that by the stroke of midnight she would come face to face with the terror that had been stalking her from the shadows. The last day anyone saw Dorothy Jane Scott alive began unremarkably. It was a Wednesday. Dorothy dropped off her son at her parents' house in the morning, then headed to work. That evening, her employer called a staff meeting at the shop in Anaheim. Dorothy attended, likely thinking of nothing more pressing than getting home in time to tuck her son into bed. But as the meeting went on, she noticed one of her co-workers, 25-year-old Conrad Bostrom, looked ill. Conrad's complexion was pale and sweaty, and he kept rubbing his arm in pain. Spotting a red, swelling lump on Conrad's arm, Dorothy grew alarmed. It looked serious, possibly a poisonous spider bite. Without hesitation, Dorothy decided Conrad needed medical attention. Always the caregiver, she volunteered to drive him to the nearest emergency room. Another co-worker, Pam Head, offered to come along and help. The three left the meeting around 9:00 p.m. and headed to UC Irvine Medical Center in Dorothy's car. As they set off, Dorothy realized her parents' house was on the way. Concerned about her son being out late, she suggested a quick stop there. She wanted to check on her 4-year-old and let her parents know she'd be delayed. They pulled up at Dorothy's parents' Anaheim home en route to the hospital. Dorothy ran inside briefly to explain the situation, and in a small act that would later become hauntingly significant, she changed her black scarf to a red one before returning to the car. No one thought much of it at the time, but that red scarf would soon become a key detail known only to Dorothy's stalker and the police. By roughly 10:30 p.m, they arrived at the hospital. The emergency room was moderately busy, but Conrad was seen by doctors reasonably quickly. As suspected, he had been bitten by a black widow spider, it turned out. While doctors tended to Conrad, Dorothy and Pam sat together in the waiting room flipping through magazines, making small talk to pass the time. Conrad was discharged around 11 o'clock p.m, bandaged and given a prescription for medication. He was still woozy and weak from the venom, so Dorothy, ever thoughtful, offered to go fetch the car while Pam stayed with Conrad. It was now around 11:20 p.m. The night was still and dark. Pam and Conrad waited just outside the sliding doors, scanning the driveway for Dorothy's white station wagon. Minutes ticked by. Dorothy didn't show. After 5 minutes or so, they stepped to the edge of the parking lot, looking out among the rows of cars. That's when they saw it. Dorothy's car, headlights on full beam, racing toward them. The Toyota station wagon came hurtling from the far end of the lot. Pam and Conrad instinctively waved, trying to flag Dorothy down. The headlights were blinding, boring into their eyes. The car barreled straight past them. Pam caught only a blur behind the wheel. Was it Dorothy? She couldn't tell. The glare was too intense. They watched in bewilderment as Dorothy's car sped to the lot's exit and made a sharp right turn, squealing out onto the road at high speed. In a matter of seconds, the red taillights vanished into the darkness down the street. Silence returned, leaving Pam and Conrad standing there, stunned. Pam's first thought was Dorothy's little boy. Could Dorothy have gotten an urgent message somehow? It seemed odd. Dorothy hadn't mentioned any call or emergency. Still, why else would she take off like that, leaving them behind? The possibility of her friend's panic over her child was the only explanation that made sense in that moment. Pam and Conrad tried to reassure each other. Surely Dorothy would either come right back or call them from wherever she'd gone. For a few minutes, they waited outside, expecting the Toyota to circle back. It didn't. Uncertain what to do, the two eventually reported Dorothy's strange disappearance to a security guard or hospital staff. Meanwhile, at the Scott family home in Anaheim, Dorothy's parents Jacob and Vera had grown worried themselves. Hours earlier, Dorothy had said she was taking a coworker to the hospital. By midnight, she hadn't come back to pick up her sleeping son. The house phone rang in the early morning hours. It was Pam, distraught, informing them that Dorothy had vanished from the hospital parking lot. Around 4:30 a.m., the Scots' worst fears materialized. Approximately 10 miles away, in an alley in Santa Ana, Dorothy's station wagon was discovered, but on fire. Flames licked the early dawn sky as firefighters doused the burning car. By the time the blaze was extinguished, the vehicle was a blackened shell. The intensity of the fire had charred the interior, destroying any clues that might have been left behind. But one thing was clear: Dorothy was not inside. There were no remains in the car. There was also no sign of Dorothy nearby. The alley was otherwise empty. Authorities now knew they were likely dealing with a crime. A young woman had seemingly been abducted in her own car right in front of a hospital. The car was then dumped and set ablaze in an apparent attempt to cover up evidence or divert attention. The timeline was chilling. Dorothy left her friends at 11:30 p.m. Within an hour or so, something happened in that parking lot that led to her speeding away. And roughly 4 hours later, her car was found burning. There was no trace of Dorothy or any suspect. In the span of one night, Dorothy Jane Scott had vanished. The kind, cautious single mother who had been haunted by a faceless tormentor was now missing, and the circumstances pointed to a terrifying conclusion. Whoever had been calling her had likely made good on his threats. The question now was, where was Dorothy? And would the mysterious caller make himself known in the wake of her disappearance? the Scott family's ordeal was only just beginning, and the strange and sinister events of the next few days would cement this case as one of Orange County's most baffling unsolved mysteries. In the hours after Dorothy's disappearance, her parents were thrust into every parent's worst nightmare. Jacob Scott drove to the police station as dawn broke, filing an official missing person report for his daughter. The police at first hoped for a benign explanation. Maybe Dorothy had taken off voluntarily or been confused by something. But Dorothy's abandoned burning car told a different story, one of violence and foul play. The local police, including campus security and the Anaheim police, began their investigation. But in the initial days, they kept a low profile. They advised the Scott family not to speak too openly to the media about the case to avoid false leads or crank tips. Jacob and Vera clung to hope, trying to believe Dorothy might still be found safe. Yet each passing hour with no word from her felt like an eternity. Then, about a week after Dorothy vanished, the phone rang at the Scott residence. The line was eerily quiet for a moment, and then she heard that voice, the same unidentified male voice that had been haunting Dorothy.
Are you related to Dorothy Scott?
Dorothy's mother, heart pounding, said yes. Then came the man's cold statement,
I've got her.
And he hung up. It was him. The mysterious caller had followed through on his threats. Now he was calling Dorothy's parents, dangling the horrible possibility that Dorothy was in his clutches. Vera was shaken to the core. Jacob, equally horrified, now understood with certainty what they were up against. This was the same monster who had been tormenting their daughter for months. He had made his move. From that point on, nearly every Wednesday, the day Dorothy disappeared, the phone would ring at the Scott home, and Vera, who was often alone in the afternoons, would answer to hear the same voice. Sometimes he simply asked, "Is Dorothy home?" Other times he'd say, "I've killed her," or "I have her." Then click. He'd disconnect before Vera could even beg for answers. Each call was a dagger in the hearts of Dorothy's parents, a cruel game of cat and mouse by a faceless coward. It seemed the caller somehow knew the family's routine, that Jacob was usually out during those times. He toyed with Vera, alternating between claiming he still held Dorothy captive and bragging that he had murdered her. There was never any ransom demand, never any clear motive given, only torment. Police investigators, now fully aware of the sinister pattern, installed a voice recorder on the Scott's home phone and began tracing attempts. But the caller was sly and cautious. He never stayed on the line for more than a brief moment, not long enough for the trace to succeed. It was like he was reading a script of terror, delivering his cruel message and disconnecting in victory. To the investigators, it suggested that the caller was likely the perpetrator himself, basking in the aftermath of his crime. Meanwhile, the search for Dorothy was in full swing. Police and volunteers scoured the areas between the hospital and where the car was found, looking for any trace of the missing woman. Flyers bearing Dorothy's photograph were posted around Orange County. Friends and family held out hope that Dorothy might still be alive somewhere, even as the ominous calls hinted at a darker outcome. Jacob Scott, frustrated by the slow progress, decided to take a risk. Against the initial advice to keep things quiet, he reached out to the local media to publicize his daughter's disappearance. On June 12, 1980, 2 weeks after Dorothy vanished, the Register published an article about the case, finally bringing the strange tale of Dorothy Jane Scott into the public eye. The story mentioned the basic facts: Dorothy's disappearance from UCI Medical Center, the burning car, and that authorities were investigating. The family hoped that publicity might lead to tips or someone recognizing Dorothy or the suspect. That same day, June 12th, shortly after the newspaper hit the stands, the managing editor of the Orange County Register, Pat Riley, received a phone call at his desk, one he would never forget. "I killed her. I killed Dorothy Jane Scott. She was my love. I caught her cheating with another man. She denied having someone else. I killed her." The words spilled out in a rush, the caller's tone matter of fact, almost satisfied. Pat Riley froze, his reporter's pen scratching to a halt on his notepad. The man on the line continued in a creepy monologue, revealing details only the real killer would know. That coworker she was with, the man, he had a spider bite, didn't he? And Dorothy was wearing a red scarf that night. Riley's blood ran cold. In the June 12th article, they had deliberately withheld certain details at the request of police, like the fact that Conrad Bostron had been treated for a spider bite and that Dorothy had swapped her black scarf for a red one before going to the hospital. Yet this caller knew all of it. Pat Riley tried to keep the man talking, heart pounding, signaling a colleague to start a trace. But the caller abruptly ended. Before Riley could press for more, the line went dead. He slowly hung up, stunned. Immediately, he contacted the police and relayed everything he'd heard. Investigators now had even more proof linking the mystery caller to Dorothy's case. This was almost certainly the same man who had been harassing Dorothy and her family. He knew things only the perpetrator at the scene would know, the spider bite, the red scarf, and he effectively confessed to killing Dorothy. The mention of Dorothy as his love, and the claim that he caught her cheating, strongly suggested a jealous obsession was at play. But Dorothy's family and friends were perplexed. Dorothy had no boyfriend, no romantic entanglement that anyone knew of. In other words, Dorothy barely had time for a social life, let alone an affair. The caller's story was a twisted fantasy. With this new information, police dug deeper into Dorothy's background and acquaintances. They interviewed Conrad Bostron and Pam Head extensively. Both were ruled out as suspects. Investigators also tracked down the biological father of Dorothy's son, thinking perhaps a jealous ex might be involved. He was living in Missouri at the time and had a solid alibi. He hadn't been in California except for a brief visit, and was confirmed to be out of state when Dorothy disappeared. No witnesses to an abduction had come forward. No physical evidence, like blood or a weapon, was found in the charred car. The caller, while brazen, was technologically savvy enough to remain untraceable. Weeks turned into months. The ongoing calls to the Scotts were the only indication that something awful had indeed happened to Dorothy. This devastated Dorothy's family, but they refused to abandon hope completely, not without proof of what happened to their daughter. The calls continued to haunt Dorothy's family and continued for 4 years when they finally learned the truth of her fate. A truth that offered heartbreak and, in its own way, a form of closure, even as it opened a new chapter in this haunting mystery. Over 4 years after Dorothy Jane Scott vanished, construction workers near Santa Ana Canyon stumbled upon skeletal human remains in a shallow gully. The remains were charred, partially burned in a brush fire that had swept through the area 2 years earlier, suggesting the victim had died around 1980. Nearby were the remains of a dog, a turquoise ring, and a woman's wristwatch stopped at 12:30 a.m. on May 29, 1980, the night Dorothy disappeared. Dental records confirmed what her parents had feared. The remains were Dorothy's. The news brought both grief and closure to Jacob and Vera Scott. On August 22, 1984, Dorothy was laid to rest. Her 8-year-old son stood beside his grandparents as the community mourned. While the medical examiner couldn't determine an exact cause of death, evidence suggested Dorothy had been murdered shortly after her abduction. The location, not far from where her burning car had been found, indicated she was likely killed the same night. And then the phone rang again. Even after the discovery made headlines, the anonymous caller resumed his taunts, calling Dorothy's parents asking, "Is Dorothy home?" before hanging up. The cruel game resumed for several weeks until increased police scrutiny drove him back into silence. The discovery reignited public interest and law enforcement efforts. The case, now officially a homicide, raised the ultimate question: who was Dorothy's stalker? The man who knew her schedule, what she wore, and referred to her as "my love"? Theories emerged. He likely knew Dorothy personally, perhaps a co-worker, customer, or someone from her neighborhood or church. The obsessive nature of his calls and claims of jealousy hinted at a delusional romantic fixation. His methods were careful and bold, abducting Dorothy from a hospital parking lot and setting her car on fire without being seen. The repeated phone calls revealed a deep need for power and control, behavior seen in serial offenders. Some pointed to a man with a history of mental instability who reportedly knew Dorothy through mutual friends. He moved out of state shortly after her remains were discovered and died in 2014. Police never confirmed his involvement. Another theory involved a possible serial offender. In 1982, 2 years after Dorothy vanished, 25-year-old Patricia Jean Schneider disappeared in a similar fashion. Late at night, her car found burning, her body never recovered. The similarities raised suspicions, but no direct link was found. Despite multiple leads and renewed investigations over the years, no arrests were made. The only enduring clue was the caller's voice, which could never be traced with the technology of the time. Jacob and Vera raised Dorothy's son, shielding him as best they could. As he grew older, he too longed for answers. Their grief was compounded by the unknown. Why would someone target such a kind, gentle woman? Dorothy's murder shook the community. It helped spur awareness around stalking, a concept not yet widely understood or criminalized in 1980. Her case helped pave the way for future laws protecting victims of obsessive harassment. Dorothy's grave is quiet now, a peaceful contrast to the fear that marked her final days. Her son, now grown, has spoken about her memory and the legacy of her kindness. He has chosen forgiveness over bitterness, though he still seeks justice. Her story, filled with unsettling phone calls, a mysterious abduction, and a voice without a face, continues to haunt cold case detectives and true crime communities alike. Technological advances may one day lead to a break. Digitized voice recordings and genealogical databases offer a glimmer of hope. Though Jacob and Vera passed without knowing who killed their daughter, they never stopped believing the truth would come to light. Dorothy's story endures, not only as a chilling mystery, but as a warning, a reminder of how dangerous stalking can become, and how important it is to take such threats seriously. Who killed Dorothy Jane Scott? The question still echoes, and until it is answered, Dorothy's voice will continue to be heard in the telling of her story, and in the hope that justice will one day arrive.